authority to do what she did? Yes, she did. What kind of authority? No, not express, not implied. So it must be apparent authority, right? Based on agency by Estoppel, right? The principal did something to lead the third party to believe Brenda had authority she didn't really have. And what was it that what they did or didn't do? Right? They wrote down at first, and then they tried to change it orally, and here she is running around with a piece of paper that says she has the authority to do what she really didn't have authority to do. So when the principal causes third party to believe the agent has authority they don't, or somebody's their agent when they're not, then it's their own fault. I almost said stupid. In our house, that's a swear word. And seriously, my daughter was watching Fox News with me, and one of the persons said Obama was stupid. And she said, "Daddy, how come it didn't bleep that?" Sorry, just thought that was funny. So that is agency by estoppel. That is authority. It's apparent authority. And then we have this last type of agency, which we've had this by operation of law come up repeatedly, right? When all else fails, the law will step in and create something that wasn't there. When have we talked about that before? When the law made something that wasn't there. Remember in contracts, what did we call it? Quasi-contract, right? Contracts implied in law. This is like quasi-agency. There really isn't an agency, but the law is going to make one up. Like you remember when minors were allowed to avoid contracts, but they couldn't if it was for necessaries? Well, this is kind of the flip side of that. If minors can't avoid the contract, someone's going to have to pay. How's the law make someone pay when they can't pay? It implies there's some kind of agency that exists. And it says if your family gets necessaries, you're responsible for paying up. Not as regular as the other types of agency, but it's there. Don't forget about agency by estoppel and apparent authority. You will see it again soon and then later. There will be a question on the final exam every semester. I put this on there because it's related to one of the outcomes about agency. And it'll say, if you get rid of express and implied authority, then the agent no longer has any authority. And everybody forgets about apparent authority. So don't forget about it. All right, so this was also part of the group exercise. Remember this one? Carpet salesperson termed real estate salesperson, right? And he originally it seemed like he broke which duty? Well, I don't know if it is against the law to install carpet yourself. But it's a breach of the duty of... No. Which duty up there? Yes, thank you. So, by acting for himself and for the customer, he breached the duty of loyalty. So, you are supposed to act for the principal if you're an agent, not yourself. Now, it's not a breach of the duty of loyalty to get compensated for acting as an agent, but when you act in your own interest, then that would be a violation. Right? So there's a real estate company here in Grand Rapids that advertises, if we don't sell your house, we'll buy it from you. I won't say what it is, but if you were creative, how could that lead to a breach in the duty of loyalty? Because it seems like you're helping out your principal. If I can't sell your house, I'll buy it from you. If you are creative, maybe none of you are. Right. So you put in the contract a buyout at a low price, which, I don't know, makes a little bit of sense. You don't want to pay top dollar for something. But let's say you're selling a house and a buyer comes along and they're willing to give the seller what they want. You might think, well, gee, why don't I pocket that money? So you go back to the buyer or the seller and say, no offers on your house. Then you do what? Buy it at a lower price, then turn around and sell it to whoever at a higher price, and you keep the difference. I'm not saying that happens, but I'm just saying in those situations, well, any situation where you're acting as an agent in a real estate transaction, there's the potential for you to breach the duty of loyalty by acting for yourself. Or attorneys. Attorneys have the same thing. They could, in a negotiation, do something that benefits their bottom line in terms of what they'll get compensated for and not be necessarily as beneficial to their client. So the duty of loyalty. Another situation, you're working for one company and before you quit, you let all your customers know you're leaving and that they should all come be with you after you're gone. What's the problem with that? You're taking your principal's clients somewhere else. You're acting in your own interest, not in the interest of the principal. So lots of ways you could breach that duty of loyalty. Performance, you should do with reasonable diligence and skill what you've agreed to do, unless you're supposed to have special skills. So accountants or doctors or whatever should exercise the degree of skill necessary in that field, equivalent to what other CPAs, doctors would exercise. Notification. If you know something that you get through a third party that the principal should know, you have a duty to notify the principal. Maybe it's an offer, and you need to communicate that. Obedience. You need to do what the principal tells you to do, as long as it's within the scope of the agency. And accounting. Money that belongs to the principal doesn't go in your pocket. Attorneys get in trouble with that one too. They take money in a settlement or something and they commingle it in their own account. Or they get a bunch of money and they go, oh, I'm going to earn this someday, and they go spend it before they've earned it. That could be a breach of the duty of accounting. All right, now, principal's duties to the agent. Oops, I didn't mean to go that fast. Compensation, if that's part of the agreement, either express or implied. Reimbursement and indemnification are a little bit different. You guys understand reimbursement, right? You go out on behalf of your principal, you spend some money, but it shouldn't come out of your pocket, so you seek reimbursement from the principal, probably like an employer. Indemnification has to do with liability. So reimbursement has to do with expense, indemnification has to do with liability. Let's say you, as the agent, get sued. Now, why would a third party sue you, the agent, when they know you're not the principal? They may not know who the principal is. Or they may be really ticked at you because you're the agent and you're the one that told them something. You're the only one they have dealt with. So they could come after you. Indemnification is the process of saying, hey, I'm the agent, I was acting within some authority, therefore I'm not liable, and passing that on to the principal. So if you get sued and you're held responsible for something, you can turn around and seek indemnification from the principal for whatever you're liable for, as long as you're acting within the scope of your authority. Cooperation. What would be a good example of a principal not cooperating with their agent? One at a time. I need to repeat this back so people can hear this in the recording. Laugh, laugh, laugh. That's what they're saying right now. Let me ask again. If these are principal's duties owed to an agent, what could the principal do that wouldn't be very cooperative? Go on. I'm intrigued. What is it the principal could do or not do that the agent needs them to do? I suppose, yeah. I mean, that's the breach of the duty of compensation not to pay them. But what if the agent relays a reasonable offer to the principal, which the principal said they would agree to? Here's what I'll sell the house for, or here's what I'll, if you get a contract for this amount with these terms, I'll accept it. But then they purposely don't cooperate. Right? They won't sign anything they're supposed to. They won't agree to whatever they said they would agree to. Right? You can't find them. You can't contact them. They won't take your calls. So you could, as a principal, this is a principal acting in a way that's not cooperative. And provide safe working conditions to the agent. You see this a lot in employer-employee situations where if they're doing a job for you, you want to make sure that they're in a safe working environment so they don't get hurt, and you would have liability for it. All right, so agent's authority. This is the next major concept in the chapter, and I'm not sure I have said it enough, so I'll say it one more time. Don't forget about apparent authority. If you don't have actual authority, an agent could still have authority because they have apparent authority. Actual authority is either express or implied. And express means what? Written or spoken. I mean, oral, right? So actual authority is either express or implied. Express authority is either oral or written. Implied often comes from expressed authority. There's a slide coming up on it, but when I have a contract to sell a home, every term of how I'm going to sell that is not in the contract. So it's implied I can do things that are reasonable to sell the home. All right, so apparent authority is when it appears to who that the agent has authority? No. Right, the third party. Apparent authority means it appears to the third party that the agent has authority when they don't have actual authority. I just want to keep pointing that out, that it's not what Brenda would say or do, but it's what the principal, commodity sales, in our group discussion did that matters. And a good example of how you get that is Estoppel. And then ratification. Remember, that's where the agent isn't an agent for the principal or doesn't have the authority but is given it after the fact. In that group discussion, we could have changed it to be ratification, right? How could we have done that with Brenda and Dennis? How could we made it so whatever Brenda did that Dennis told her not to do on the phone, she was subsequently authorized to do?
If you would have made her aware that
Let me ask the question again. That's right. Well, what is it that Dennis could say after the fact, after Brenda did something she wasn't supposed to, that would be considered ratification? Right. So Brenda comes back to Dennis and says, look what I did. And he says, hey, I told you over the phone not to do that. And she says, I know, but we really needed to do that. And he goes, okay, you have authority. She didn't have authority at the time, but now she does. Now she's off the hook. She's not in trouble. And he's authorized whatever she did. That's ratification. Right? So whenever the principal, in this case through their agent, Dennis, does something afterwards to give the agent authority that they didn't have at the time. So be able to distinguish between ratification and estoppel. Can you? What's the difference?
Estoppel is the authority that the third party can say you might have.
Mm-hmm.
Ratification is the principal gives to you after the fact.
Yep. So one's at the time, one's afterwards. At the time, the principal does something to lead the third party to believe the agent has authority they don't have. All right. So I think with most groups I snuck this one in. I mentioned the rule, the equal dignity rule. And just to go back and look at it from what the rule actually says, it says if the law requires the contract to be in writing, so let's say in the case of Brenda, because the contract was for the sale of goods over $500, the UCC required it to be in writing. If the UCC required the contract to be in writing, which it was, then the agency should be in writing. That's the equal dignity rule. Contract, agency. One's in writing, the other should be in writing too. I took it a step further by saying if the writing, the agency's authority is in writing, then if you modify it, you ought to do that in writing too. Now, sometimes you can't have everything in writing all the time, like that first exception. An officer acting for a corporation can't have everything they do put in writing first. If they're doing something on behalf of the corporation all the time, every day, it's their job, and they can't wait for written authorization for every single thing they do. So they have broad authority to act on behalf of the corporation. Or the other scenario is that the agent and principal are together when it happens. So think back about Dennis and Brenda. Brenda shows up at, was it Eagle? Eagle's place of business with the written authority, and Dennis is standing right there. Right? Earlier, Dennis had told her, don't do this. But right in front of Dennis, Brenda represents that she has authority to do what she did. This says, well, then you don't need written authority because the principal is represented through Dennis, who's standing right there, and if the principal had objections, they should have let it be known. So apply to that whatever scenario you want. A real estate agent selling your house, but you're standing right there when it happens. A power of attorney is an agency. It's a writing that gives somebody power to act on someone else's behalf. In fact, attorney kind of means agent, which means if you've been an agent before, you could say you're an attorney, but not attorney at law, right? I'm an agent as the law. You're not. But has anybody ever had power of attorney for someone else or know of that? Okay. So it mentions ordinary and durable up there. An ordinary power of attorney gives someone power to act on someone else's behalf as long as the principal has the ability to know what they're doing. So I'll give you an example. When my wife and I were closing on a real estate transaction, she couldn't make it. So she gave me power of attorney to act for her in that specific transaction. Which, by the way, is a real good way, if you're going to do it. Give it sparingly for specific reasons. So-and-so has my authority to act in this matter this time. Because if you give someone broad authority to do anything for you, in writing, what might happen? What happened? Anything pretty much like what Brenda did. Run around with a writing, doing things she wasn't authorized to really do. Someone could go around and act in their own interest and not yours. So giving someone broad power to do anything on your behalf, you better really trust them. And you should have a really good reason. Military deployments, there are some situations where you just need to give someone else authority to act on your behalf. There's nothing you can do about it. Don't do what?
When you're military being deployed, you don't give out a broad.
Right.
Used to be, like when I was in, I gave my wife power of attorney over everything, and they don't do that anymore.
Yeah. Well, because, why?
She wrote $50,000 check.
Yeah, because it was, the solution was supposed to help service members, but in the end, didn't help them all that much in some cases, because, yeah. So being specific is a pretty good idea. Now, a durable power of attorney survives your disability. This is a type of attorney that you put in place because you're concerned that at some point you may not be able to make your own decisions. Right? So there's like medical durable power of attorney. So if something happens to you, you end up on life support, that someone will be able to make a decision for you. But durable power of attorney survive disability. Generally, if you don't have the authority to act for yourself, someone else is not going to be able to act for you. But you may want to give someone authority to act for you when you can't act yourself. Either way, they don't survive death. That's not in your chapter, but I'm throwing that in there for you. Because I've had people come up to me and say, I have authority in writing to act for this person. And I say, okay, where is this person? Oh, they're dead. Then you no longer have authority. If there's no principle, there's no agency. Does that make sense? So people have that authority, and then somebody dies, and they've been acting for them for years, managing their finances or whatever, and now that person is deceased, and they're running around with a piece of paper that says, I have authority to act for this person. It no longer has any effect. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what a will is. A will is written instructions for someone else to do what you can't do because you're dead. So you appoint a personal representative to act not while you're living, but after you're dead. The durable power of attorney is while you're living. And folks need to make sure they keep those two things straight. All right, so I mentioned this earlier, that actual authority includes implied authority. It might be inferred. It might be just the way business is done in that area. It might be that it comes out the express authority that was given to the agent and includes whatever the agent reasonably thinks they're authorized to do. So even if a contract to sell a home doesn't say you can put a sign in the front yard, it's implied that you can do that. Market, do the things that you need to do, although that's common to put in a real estate contract to sell a home. It would be implied. And then parent, and we've mentioned Estoppel as an example of that. And the last one talks about how, there's constantly attempts to kind of balance this and have independent contractors do work for you. In a medical setting, why would you want to have the folks that are doing work for you to be independent contractors and not your employees? All right. Liability is one of the biggies. The problem can become when you treat them like your employees, so the law says, well, they are, or they're acting for you and you claim they're not your agent, but it appears they are, and they're acting like an agent, and you're letting them act like your agent. Okay? So, if you hire an independent contractor to do work for you, what should you do to avoid making it appear as if they're your employee or that they're authorized to act as your agent when they're not. That's right. Don't just, all right, here's the job. Go do it. You're the expert. I'm not going to control your work. And I'm not going to do anything to lead third parties to believe, patients or whatever, that this person is my agent. They're just contracted for a room or whatever it is, but they're responsible for their own liability. All right. Now, we've mentioned ratification several times. It's coming up again because it has to do with apparent authority or the agent's authority. And here are the specific things that the principal needs to do to ratify an unauthorized act. So an agent is acting for the principal. They just did something they weren't supposed to. The principal learns about it afterwards, and knowing the whole thing, agrees to ratify it. So I tell my real estate agent, don't sell the carpet. They come back with an agreement that says, we're selling the carpet. What should they do as an agent to get me to ratify something that they weren't originally authorized to do? How does an agent cover themselves when they acted beyond what they should have done? Based on these factors here. Right. Exactly. They should come back and disclose to the principal exactly what they did, show it to them in writing, and said, I know you told me not to do this, but here it is, I did it. Please ratify or agree to do this. How could an agent not have their action ratified? What's the biggie they could do when they come back and they've done something they're not supposed to do? Try to hide it, right? Put their thumb over it, not mention it. When asked about it, don't mention it. Outright lie about it. An agent's unauthorized acts are not going to be ratified if the principal didn't have any way of knowing about it. So if you're an agent at some point in the future, let me think about it. Remember, employees are agents, right? So you, acting for your employer, agree with a third party to do something on behalf of the employer. You want to make sure you go back and fully disclose exactly what you did so you don't have any personal liability for it. All right, so we talked about when we say liability, the different types of liability, contract liability, tort liability. There's different types of liability that may fall on the principal or agent. And in the discussion of liability for contracts is this whole idea of, well, we might assume that people know who the principal is, but turns out that's not always the case. There are some situations where the principal doesn't want the third party to know who they are. Can you think of any reason why?
Well, I was just saying that
That's
that's how I got my job.
how you got your job.
No, that's how it is at my job.
How is it at your job?
Like we don't know who the client is.
You don't know who the client is?
No, we can't see him.
What kind of job you got there?
We can't see him or talk to him. They only deal with us.
Well, we're talking about principles that aren't disclosed. You sound, when you say the boss and clients, it sounds like you're the agent from what you describe. I don't know if you are, but it sounds like that's what you're.
Well, we make phone calls on behalf of the client, which is the person that we don't see.
Right, but that's not what makes a principle disclosed, partially disclosed, or undisclosed. You're saying when you call the principal's clients, you don't ever see them.
He's saying he's making calls for the
Principal.
no, for he is calling the clients, but is he saying that the principal is what the principal
Oh, okay, so you're using client in the sense of a principal.
Right.
Okay. So the client is a creditor who's extended credit to a third party, and you're acting as the client's agent in trying to collect a debt from the third party. And when you do that, don't you disclose to whoever you're talking to who they owe a debt to? If I'm following your scenario here, don't you?
Well, in this case, it's not the debt, it's just like who's calling on behalf.
Oh, okay. So telemarketing.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay. Something like that.
Yeah.
Are you selling something or are you collecting something?
Collecting opinions.
What?
Collecting opinions.
Opinions. Oh, okay. So you're like polling on behalf of someone else. All right, maybe this isn't the best scenario.
Researching.
You're researching.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just when you said you don't be able to see the
Well, this is focused on what the third party knows about the principal. So if the people you're calling think they're dealing with you and you're the only party, they don't know of anybody else,
right.
that might be the situation.
Yeah,
Okay. So in a disclosed principal situation, the third party knows that there's somebody else besides the agent who is the principal, and they know who it is. Hi, I'm so-and-so. I'm calling on behalf of so-and-so. Right? So they understand that somebody's calling them who's an agent and that they're calling on behalf of someone else who's the principal. Partially disclosed. Hi, I'm calling for someone who does marketing research, and I'd like to know these things. You don't disclose who the principal is, right? They just know there must be someone else. Undisclosed. Hi, I was just wondering, blah, blah, blah. Like, you don't tell them there's anybody else involved. Right? Well, let's try the real estate example. Let's say there's a principal who's a developer who wants to develop property here in Grand Rapids. Why might they not want a third party to know who they are? Right. Whatever that developer is, maybe they want to buy the property to level it. And they figured if the third party knew who it was, like Ellis Parking. I don't know. Like, if Ellis Parking calls to buy your place, it might be flat soon. I don't know. It may not be flat for long. It might go up, yeah. What if you got a whole lot of money? If you have a whole bunch of money and you call people and say, I'd like to buy your property, what are they going to say? Yeah, it's going to cost you a whole lot of money, right? So maybe you want to deal through an agent who's not going to disclose all the information. Of course, if you ever have somebody come to your door and say, knock, knock, hi, I represent some undisclosed person who'd like to buy your property, just think, ching, right? Because it's probably somebody who's got a lot of money. Or who thinks you hate them, I guess. Or in the actual case of, I don't remember who the principal was, but there was a guy who often developed property for adult entertainment, and he was trying to buy some riverfront property here in Grand Rapids. Remember that? And it was like, mystery developer, right? Trying to buy some property. And the agent was like, I'm not really going to say who it is. Why wasn't the agent disclosing who the developer was? Right, because of what the developer had done in other places and the fear here that that might be what happened with the property if it was acquired by this developer. So sometimes you don't want the third party to know who you are because they might think bad things or different things about you. All right, so why are we going through all this? Because in some way it doesn't really matter what the third party knows about the principal. As long as the agent is acting with the proper authority, the agent's not liable, the principal is, even if the third party doesn't know there is one. There's another way of buying property if you don't want the third party to know who you are. You get the agent to buy the property, and then you buy it from the agent, I suppose. And here's the connected slide. And if it's a disclosed or partially disclosed principal, they're liable to the third party as long as the agent acted within the scope of their authority. Where this becomes a problem is when the third party doesn't know anything about a principal and the agent starts acting without any authority. So think about it. If you're an agent for an undisclosed principal, what do you want to make sure of? You want to make sure you have clear authority to do whatever you do, because later, if there's a problem, who's the third party going to come back for? The agent, because they don't know about anybody. As far as they know, you are it. Right? They don't realize you are an agent. So they're coming after you. They don't name anybody else in the lawsuit. So you should make sure that you have specific written authority to do what you did. And then the other part, the flip side of that is, what if you're an agent for an undisclosed principal and the principal isn't doing what they're supposed to? Again, who's the third party going to come back after? The agent. And the agent's going to be like, hey, I'm just a go-between. If there's another party who's not doing what they're supposed to, suddenly the principal is not going to be undisclosed. Right? So, generally, the less the third party knows about the principal, and the more the agent acts outside their authority, the more chance there is the agent's going to be liable and the principal is not. They're out there acting on their own. So, even in a situation involving an undisclosed principal, the principal is liable unless they've done something to exclude themselves from liability. Hey, agent, you're out there on their own. If you enter into some type of agreement and act outside your scope of your authority, you're liable. I'm not. Now, when I say unauthorized act, I mean no authority whatsoever. That means no express, implied, or apparent authority to do what you did. And if you're an agent acting with none of those types of authority, then you are liable and the principal is not. This usually occurs when you do something that was not anything that the principal asked you to do, or you are doing something the principal asked you to do, but it's outside of any express, implied, or apparent authority. So I think back to the Brenda Dennis situation. What should Dennis have done? Remember? Right. His best bet would have been to put in writing the changes to Brenda's authority and give it to Brenda and give it to the third party. Right? That way, the principal's covered. And if she ends up doing something outside that specific written authority that she was told not to do, then she's liable for it. He's not. All right, and then that liability could extend to e-agents. There are real people agents and there are electronic agents. You can have websites or bots or things on the internet acting on your behalf. There's little I don't know, bots makes it sound like they're creatures or something, but there are electronic agents that go out and search for other sites, search for specific things, do specific things that you've programmed them or told them to do. Right, you could give a website parameters of when to buy, when to sell, and it will execute it, and you've given it the authority to do that, and as long as it acts within the authority you've given it. Right? It's kind of like, anybody see the IBM computer that beat out the two top Jeopardy people? What if Watson becomes self-aware? Sounds like Terminator, but right? Watson, I was listening to this news thing about how they trained Watson. They kept giving it instructions, and then if it ever made a mistake, it's like, I don't know how many cores it had at its disposal, then they would teach it. So you're teaching a computer how to keep refining its reasoning until it got to, it could beat humans at Jeopardy. But then you give that set of computers authority to go do something. They go out there and do it, as long as it acts within the authority it's given. The principal, whoever sent it to do that task, is responsible for it. Liability for torts and crimes. An agent who commits a tort is liable for their own torts. That makes sense? You can't run around and beat up people for your employer and avoid personal liability for doing that. But by doing that, you may also open your employer to have liability for it. Anybody ever been in a work situation where a fellow employee or you did something that was negligent and harmed a customer? Ever seen that happen? No one's been in forklift races or nail gun fights or nothing like that? Okay, I wouldn't admit to it either. So, in a situation where people are operating equipment or something and they end up harming the public, the employer could have liability for that. I told you about my buddy who's got his vehicle destroyed at the car wash, didn't I? I don't know if I told everybody that story, but in that story, an employee takes his Jeep and drives it in the parking lot next door and crashes it. The employer had liability for that. Tort liability, what's that called? When somebody accidentally accelerates a vehicle that's entrusted to them and damages it. What kind of tort is that? Yeah, it's an unintentional tort. It's an accident. It's negligence, right? So think about valet parking or, any other situation. You would lead your employer to have liability for that. There's a principal to have liability for it. A principal could have liability because they told the agent to do something that's tortious. At the bottom there, it talks about Respondeat superior, which means the superior is responsible for the acts of their employee, basically. This is a employer-employee relationship doctrine. It only applies when we're talking about employers and employees. If employees do things within the scope and course of their employment, employers are liable for it.
So if it's unauthorized, not fraudulent, but still tortuously made in the scope of agency, is the principal liable?
So let me see if I understand your question. One of your salespeople commits fraud in selling a car, or something.
No, it's not fraudulent.
It's not fraudulent. It's just negligent.
It's still tortuous, and it's. Oh wait, never mind. Because you already stated that.
So, well, there's a couple situations that come up. I'll just use the used car sales example, where it's misrepresentation and it's intentional or it's not. So one of your employees, while working for you, sells a car committing fraud. Like they intentionally, tortiously misrepresent something. Then you, as the employer, could have liability for that, even though you told them not to commit fraud. Right?
But if it's not, because I know it said fraudulent before that, but if it's still tortuous and
right, it's still a tort. So if they could they accidentally or unintentionally misrepresent something?
No, I'm saying the third or the agent purposely does something torturous that's not authorized, but it's not fraudulent, but it would be considered somehow in the scope of their agency.
An intentional tort besides fraud. So somebody's working at McDonald's and someone walks up and says, hey, this coffee that I ordered isn't hot enough. And the employee turns around, grabs the pot of coffee and throws it in their face intentionally and burns them. And
Okay, I guess if the court were to rule that in the scope of their agency.
yes, I think they would, even though the employer says, don't ever throw hot coffee in someone's face. If they do it while employed during the course and scope of employment, because that's something that serving coffee is something they do.
Isn't that different than agency?
It is. It's taking that doctrine further by saying respondeat superior. Like, you better watch your employees, because if they doing something tortious during the course and scope of their employment, even though you would not have authorized it, you're going to be stuck with it. So if an employee throws hot coffee on someone's face, you're stuck with the bill. That's because if you know that they have a propensity for that, you better do something about it. You better get rid of them quickly. Or if you haven't hired them yet, you probably don't want to hire them. Like, hey, what happened to your last job? Oh, I threw coffee in someone's face. I don't think we'll hire you. Because now you know about it. Right? And so that second bullet there says that you, the principal, are vicariously liable. Even though you're not the one that did it, you're responsible for what they did. Now, in a minute here, I'm going to talk about what is within the course and scope of employment, because certainly you're going to argue that whatever that employee did intentionally was not within the scope of what they should be doing or when they should be doing it. But sometimes you win those, sometimes you lose them. There was a bunch of cases on the news this morning. One I think will be interesting to talk about in the upcoming chapter on employment and discrimination. You guys hear this story about the person who was seeking the 3 weeks off to do pilgrimage. We'll talk about that one. And then the other one was what was the Walmart one? The guy smoking marijuana?
1.5 million current female employees and employees that used to work there filing like a discrimination.
Right, gender discrimination lawsuit. There was the guy that was big news, the guy that got fired for marijuana usage, who supposedly who was using it for treatment. It was medical marijuana. The one I heard about was really strange. It was the press was at some fundraiser for the vice president, and they always have like this waiting area or room where you put the press while you're. And so they shoved the press, one of the guys who was the press, in the closet and left him there for an hour. So that was the holding area for this guy. Now he's claiming that he wasn't treated very well. Pictures of him inside the closet waiting. So I guess it's a big deal because it's the vice president. We'll see what happens with that one. But what happens when your agents do something just not very smart? So going about determining if something is within the scope of employment. This checklist should look kind of familiar. We had one for independent contractors versus employees at the start of last class. Was the Employees Act authorized for the employer? Well, certainly if they're doing something intentionally, tortiously, the employer is going to say, I didn't tell them to do that. But maybe they did. Maybe they said, if a customer ticks you off, do whatever you want to do. Hopefully not. Or maybe they said, hey, go collect that money. I don't care what you have to do to collect it. The time, place, and purpose of the act. So it's factually dependent. It depends on whether it's a rental car that you are renting at a conference, or it's a rental car that you were renting at a conference, but then you took it and did something else with it. Was the act commonly performed by the employee? That's pretty straightforward. Did the act advance the employer's interest? Did the employer furnish the instrumentality, the tool, the vehicle, the whatever it was? Did the employer have reason to know the employee would do the act? We mentioned that earlier. If you know your employees are doing things they're not supposed to, you should do something about it. And then, did the act involve a serious crime? The more serious the crime that the employee commits, the less likely is the employer is going to be liable for it. So the case I always mention is Domino's Pizza. Do you remember the 30 minutes or less, or it's free campaign? They don't do that anymore because their employees were rushing out to get the pizzas there in 30 minutes or less and started having accidents. And the reason they were having accidents is because the employer never said you're fired if you don't get it there in 30 minutes or less, but people who weren't getting it there in 30 minutes or less were getting fired. So if you're a delivery person who knows if you don't get it there in 30 minutes or less, you're going to be fired, what are you going to do? Get it there in 30 minutes or less, right? Doesn't matter whether you got to run someone over or, well, I don't know how many delivery drivers actually went up driving on sidewalks to try to get the pizza there in time, but they were in a hurry and it was causing accidents, and a number of people sued Domino's, the drivers, everyone, claiming that that Domino's should have liability for this. And the court said yes, that they should, because they were creating an environment where employees thought they'd be fired if they didn't do it. Therefore, they should be responsible for it, even though they said drive safely, don't hurt anybody. Pretty common thing to tell your drivers. Now, if the Domino's delivery drivers are out robbing banks, probably not. We need to distinguish between a detour and a frolic. So, a detour is still within the course and scope of employment. It might be a little off track. Think of it as a delivery driver driving down the road. What's a detour? Right, you know, Google Maps or whatever routes you somewhere else because it's closed down. I know this because, like, within a 2-week period, I went to Chicago twice, and one time I went through Gary, Indiana. Anybody ever been through Gary, Indiana? If you're on the highway, you can hold your nose long enough to get through. But the other time, Google Maps routed me into Gary, Indiana. There's a big difference between being up here and zooming by and down here driving through. It's just not a clean, friendly place. But I was detoured, right? Still went about my route, still did what I needed to do. What would be a frolic? I don't even know. I wasn't looking for that example. I think, delivery drivers might be able to stop and get something to eat. Right? I mean, think of the UPS driver or whatever. Don't they have to eat sometime? Maybe their employer told them, don't try to eat and drive at the same time. Stop, eat. I don't know how that works. Anybody ever delivered for a delivery service? Okay, so did you stop? Sometimes? Right? So certainly stopping, getting something to eat, getting off the road to do that would be fine.
There's sometimes where you end up going 5 miles out of your way to do that.
Right.
That's more of a problem.
Yeah.
A lot of the truck stops are right off the highway.
Yeah. I think loaning your truck out to a buddy or taking it home at night, that's a big thing. I've noticed that trucking companies used to let employees take their vehicles home. The big ones usually don't, right? Because there's a lot of liability with that, and what you do with the truck while you have it at your home or whatever. So, the further you get off the path, and the more what you're doing is your own personal business, the more chance it is a frolic than it is a detour. Maybe even if you don't get far off track, but you're doing something completely not what you're supposed to do. Like if you pull over to take a break and you buy illegal drugs and use them, that's certainly not something that you're authorized to do. We were talking about this one, liability for an agent's intentional torts, that as long as it's within the course and scope of employment, then yes. And if you know they're going to do it, then you shouldn't put them in a situation where they are going to do it, or you should get rid of them. Now, this is liability for contractors' torts, where our first determination is whether whoever is doing the work for you is an employee or independent contractor. By now we know the big reason for determining that is around liability. Generally, if the person you've employed is an independent contractor, they're liable for what they do, not you, because you can't control. Remember Fred in our group discussion? Fred was doing manuals on a case-by-case basis, doing it his own way. One exception, though, the up there is that if whatever it is they're doing is an ultra-hazardous type of thing, then you may not be able to avoid liability by having them do it. So if you need some stumps removed or you need to blow something up, you'd have liability if you blew something up. You contract to have someone else do it for you, you might still have liability for that. In our neighborhood, they were taking down some trees, and these are really big trees, and I noticed that the people who were taking the trees down, I don't know, they looked like they were contracted because they had some experience in the area, but I was watching trees flying around everywhere. I mean, close to houses, all over the place, and I'm thinking, this is not going to end well. I never heard anything crunch through anybody's house, but it might still happen. If you're cutting down trees and the tree is taller than the distance from the tree to the house, what might you do? Yeah. Cut it somehow so that when it does fall, it's not going to fall on the house, or do something to prevent it from falling that way. That'd be a good idea. All right. Crimes, I think we mentioned that one already. As a general rule, you're not going to be liable for your agent's crimes unless you told them to do it or knew they were doing it. The more serious the crime, the less likely it is that you're going to be responsible for it. Maybe there's a statute that might hold you liable for doing it. Probably like selling firearms or alcohol. There's probably some statutes around that. So this is a summary of the process that you go through when you're presented with a scenario. You've got a worker who did something. First step, determine whether an employee or an independent contractor. And then generally we know that if they're an independent contractor, the principal's not going to have liability. If they're an employee, then we need to determine if it's inside or outside the course and scope of their employment. And we were just talking about that. So first, the factors on page 490, look at that one to determine whether it's independent contractor or employee. And then, is that page right? 490? And then if they are an employee, then look at that scope of employment on page 504. So you're going to have a chance to do that here soon. Now, how agency relationships are terminated. So we talked about how they're formed. We talked about liability during them. Now we're talking about how they end. They could be terminated by the acts of the parties, or the law could terminate them. There's always the law creating them or getting rid of these types of relationships. Once the agency is terminated, the agent has no actual authority. If you fire an employee, they no longer have actual authority to act for you. But, I bet you guys know what I'm going to say, don't forget about apparent authority. Even though you've taken away their actual authority to do something, it might still appear to a third party that they do have authority to act for you. The best way to get rid of apparent authority is to let the third party know they no longer have authority. They, the agent, no longer has authority. So, if you've got agents who deal with repeat customers, send a notice out to those repeat customers that says this person is not our agent anymore, someone else is. Here are other ways the agency can be terminated. The time has passed. If you hire a real estate agent to sell your house for a 6-month period, at the end of that period, the agency is terminated. The purpose is achieved. You hire them to sell your house, they sell the house. No longer need them as your agent. Something occurs that prevents them from being able to fulfill their agency, like you sell the house to someone else. No longer can sell the house for you. Or you mutually agree that you don't want to be principal and agent anymore. Or the agent quits. Or the principal fires the agent. All those things terminate the agency relationship. And again, one more time. If you do terminate them, make sure you let other people know that you've terminated them. To get rid of what kind of authority? Apparent authority, good. So, even if the parties, one or both of them, haven't terminated the agency relationship, the law, in some cases, can step in and terminate the agency relationship. We mentioned that with the power of attorney as an example, right? If the principal dies, then you no longer have authority to act for them because they can't act for themselves. If the agent dies, they can no longer act for the principal. Right? It's hard to act as an agent after you're dead. Impossibility. Remember the example of impossibility in the group discussion? The house burns down, you can no longer sell it. Or the house gets sold to someone else. That's changed circumstances. Or bankruptcy. Bankruptcy terminates contracts and it can terminate agencies. You had someone acting for you, they can no longer act for you because there's no longer any purpose for them to act for you. Or the last one, war. I used to just say war, what's it good for? But that's because I couldn't ever think of a situation where war would step in and terminate an agency relationship. Now for the last few years it seems like there's always something going on. So if you think about it, where you're talking about Libya or you're talking about Afghanistan or wherever you're talking about, there are situations where somebody is acting for an agent for someone, but they're no longer able to carry out that agency. It's not just war. Think about Japan right now.